Hi everyone, it's Lisa. Welcome back to my channel. Before we get started, go ahead and click that subscribe button and click that bell button to be notified every time I release a new video. For today's video, I'm going to show you how to create some fun backgrounds for your cards using the Arteza Real Brush watercolor pens. And be sure to check out my previous video that I did on these pens where I showed you how to use these pens to color your stamped images. I will provide the link to that video down below. I will also provide links to all of these products in the description box below, and in case you are interested in purchasing them, you can head on over to Arteza's website and take a look at those. There's also a 10% discount code in the description box below that you can use. So for my cards that I'm going to make today, I will be using the Arteza watercolor pad, which is shown here, and this pad comes with 2 packs of 32 sheets of watercolor paper. And I'm also going to be bringing in my Arteza Real Brush pens. Now, if you have other water brush pens, these techniques will work as well. So if you have the Zig, these will work on the Zig as well. And I will also be bringing in my Arteza water brush pens. And I got these in a pack of 6 from Arteza. So let's go ahead and get started. For this first technique, I'm going to be using 3 colors, the neon pink, orange, and lemon yellow. And I have a piece of my Arteza watercolor paper, and it's cut down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And I'm doing some ink swooshing. So I have my glass mat. I just scribbled on some of the ink, each one of those markers, onto my glass mat, sprayed that ink with water, and then took my watercolor paper and just dabbed it in that ink. And you can continue to repeat this process to fill up some of the white space on your cardstock. I also want to mention that I did start off with a dry piece of watercolor paper. So the only portion that I wet was the ink on the glass mat. And if you want to make that color darker, just dry your watercolor paper and then reapply your ink. So you can continue to dry it and then add layers of your markers to make that color darker. And then once I finish with applying my colors, I'm just going to dry it one last time, or you can let it sit and dry on its own. For this next technique, I'm going to start out with a piece of watercolor paper, 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and I spritzed it with water and just wiping up some of those water droplets. So I'm starting out with a wet piece of paper here, and I'm using 4 colors, and I'm going to be using the bright blue, the neon pink, the lemon yellow, and the light magenta. And I'm just scribbling these colors onto my watercolor paper. And I want you to notice that when you add your real brush pen to the wet paper, that it makes the ink spread. And in some of the spots, like the spot up there at the top left hand corner where I laid the blue down, the paper wasn't as wet, so it didn't spread as easily. And if you add more water to that paper, you can see how that ink just spreads on that watercolor paper. So it adds for a nice washed out look of all of your various inks. And you can go back in with your markers and you can just add more ink. But I want you to notice that when the paper's wet, it's not going to add anything too dark. So if you want to continue to add layers and darken up the watercolor, you'd have to dry it. So I'm just taking a heat tool and I'm drying that paper so it's not as damp. So after you've dried it, just repeat the process by spraying that paper with water, adding your colors directly to the paper wherever you want them to appear. And then once you've done that, if you want to go ahead and spray that cardstock again to make that ink spread out some more on that paper. And once you have it the way that you like it, you can go ahead and dry it. And then you can continue to repeat that process as many times as you want until those colors are dark enough for the look that you are going for. Next, I die cut a bookmark, and it's the bookmark die from the Stamps of Life from the watercolor paper, and I spritzed it with a little bit of water. And this is a similar technique to the previous one, but I'm using 2 colors instead of 4. The colors that I'm using are the teal and the bumblebee yellow. So again, I spritz my paper with water, and then I'm adding directly with the Real Brush pen to my bookmark. And then I'm spritzing it with water again just to have those inks move around. And then you can take your heat tool and dry that paper. And notice that when you add your heat tool that some of the inks move around even more on that paper. And then repeat the process. So again, spray that paper with water, add your inks. Once you've added your inks, spray with water again so that the inks move around, and then you can either add more ink, or if you like it the way it is, you can dry it. And every time you dry it and re-wet it and reapply your inks, the inks go on as another layer, and it just adds the inks in a darker tone. For this next technique, I'm going to be using several colors to create an autumn sky. So I'm using Bristol Smooth cardstock here instead of the Arteza watercolor paper, just because the Bristol Smooth is exactly that. It's a smooth texture, and that's what I wanted. I didn't want to have the textured side on this sky. I actually did this effect with the watercolor paper, and I didn't really like how it looked, so I switched up and decided to bring in my Bristol Smooth cardstock. So the Bristol Smooth cardstock is cut at 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and the colors that I'm bringing in are the lemon yellow at the very top, bumblebee yellow, sunset yellow, orange, cadmium orange, and then red. And you can see that I'm just taking the pen, going across that dry paper, and then I'm coming in with one of my Arteza water brushes, and this is actually one of the water brushes that has the wide brush on it, and I'm just squeezing a little bit of water out of that water brush and blending those colors together. So I'm just actually going back and forth from left to right to blend each one of those colors together. So the yellow is blended from left to right, the orange, the red, so on and so forth. And once I have them blended, I will go ahead and take my heat tool and dry the paper. Now you can create all kinds of different backgrounds using this in several colors to create various sky backgrounds. I could also see doing various blue colors to create a blue sky, maybe for like an ocean sky. That would be really pretty as well. So here's the background that I did with the Bristol Smooth cardstock, and then the one on the right is the one that I did with the watercolor Arteza paper, and you can see how the difference in the blending with the Arteza. You can actually see the texture behind it. For this next one, I am taking a piece of the Arteza watercolor paper, measured 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. Again, I sprayed it with water. I do find that when you spray the cardstock with water and then add your inks directly to the cardstock, that the inks spread more easily on that paper. In addition, they go on in a much lighter tone, which is a more watered down tone, hence the term watercolor, than when you just add it directly to the dry paper. So you can also see that I brought in that Arteza water brush also to just add more water directly to the page and spread that color out as well. And then I take my heat tool, I go ahead and dry that up. Now I don't dry it completely, but then I go ahead and add some more ink, but you can see the difference when you add the ink to the drier paper than when it's saturated with water, how it goes on a little bit darker. And then when you spray it with water, again, you can just blend those colors. So it really depend on what kind of look you're looking for. If you want to add your ink to the wet paper versus the dry paper, you really just have to experiment with both. And every time you dry and reapply the ink, you're just adding another layer of ink to that paper, and you are deepening the tones. And after you add the ink, again, each time just spray it with water, move your paper around so that those inks move around on the paper. And what a pretty color. So you can see how the colors that I've used here, which again are the light green, the sapphire blue, and the red, this can be used for a more masculine card. Now I'm going to take a stencil, and this is the Circle Dots stencil from the Stamps of Life. I sprayed it with water, and then I'm just going to set it on this piece of cardstock. Now when you do this, you have to make sure that your piece is completely dry first. So your paper needs to be dry, so dry it with a heat tool, then spray your stencil with water, and then add it to your paper. And when you lift that up, first you want to let it sit there for a few good seconds so that the water seeps into the cardstock. And when you lift it up, you will see the design of that stencil on your cardstock. And then just use your heat tool to dry that. For this next technique, I am using Arteza watercolor paper cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I do spray it first to get it wet, and I'm bringing in 2 colors, and the colors are the light green as well as the light magenta. So this is a similar process to what you've seen in the previous ones, where I'm just have a wet piece of watercolor paper, adding the ink directly to the paper, drying it with my heat tool, re-wetting it, and adding more ink. And continue to repeat the process as many times as you need to get the look that you're going for. I wanted to get a more vivid look. I really like the vivid looks on these watercolor backgrounds, so I continue to repeat the process several times so that the inks are more colorful. Now for this technique, I will be bringing in some salt. And the salt, you'll see later on, it's actually going to provide a really neat look to this watercolor background. It's actually going to pull some of the ink away from the cardstock. With the cardstock a little bit wet, I go ahead and sprinkle some of my salt onto that background. Now this salt is a pink salt that I just had in a grinder that I crushed up. Let it sit there for a minute. Notice that I am taking my heat tool just to dry this up a little bit. You can probably use any kind of salt. I haven't tried all salts, just this pink grinded up salt that I have. And once that background is completely dry, just take a paper towel and rub off the salt. So the salt will actually harden on that background, but it will come off very easily once you rub it off with a paper towel. And I just love the effects of what that salt does to this watercolor background. It almost looks like water droppings on the background itself. Now let's go ahead and turn those backgrounds into cards. For this first card, I'm taking the Thanks to You stamp set, and I am going to be using it on this card. It has many sentiments for making thank you cards. So I placed my watercolor background in my MISTI, and now I'm going to take the flowers that are in that stamp set, and I am going to use those on my background. I did put a piece of just scratch paper underneath that watercolor piece because I know that these stamps are going to go off of the cardstock, so I wanted them to be able to print that ink on the scratch paper rather than on the pad in my MISTI. So I'm going to be inking them up with the Forever Black ink from the Stamps of Life. This ink produces a very black image, which I really love. It's a very crisp ink. So I did ink it up just a couple times just to make sure it is very black, and stamp that down onto the watercolor paper. Now one thing about stamping on the watercolor paper is because it is textured and it's so thick, you do have to stamp a couple times just to get a more clear impression than you would if you were just stamping on regular cardstock. So here I'm trying to take this single flower stamp, and I just want to get the stem, so that's why you see it upside down. And then I stamped the single flower on top of that stem, which this is what the stamp looked like. For some reason my camera was not on when I stamped that. And then I'm using the sentiment thanks and stamping it there off to the left of the flowers. And then I'm going to add this layer to an A2 size card base in the black. And I just added it with some art glitter glue to that card base, and then I'm using my art glitter glue and just putting a few drops on my card front and putting some of these iridescent shaker bits to the front of that card and just random locations throughout. And I just love the way that this card turned out. Very simple to do, just creating that watercolor background and stamping some black stamps and creating your card. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Happy Birthday background die from the Stamps of Life, and I'm going to die cut it out of this black cardstock, making sure there's double-sided adhesive on the back before I run it through my die cut machine. You also need to make sure that outside rounded rectangle is used when you're cutting out the background so that it cuts it out of the paper. And then you're going to use that same rounded rectangle die to die cut your watercolor paper. This will ensure that both of these cardstock pieces are the same exact size. Next, just peel back that background layer piece from the backing of the adhesive, and you're going to add that directly to the watercolored background. And it's going to fit perfectly because they were both cut out of the same rectangular die. And look how pretty that is with that watercolor paper showing through the background of that background die. So next I'm just going to add glue to the back of that layer and add it to an A2 size card base, and I cut an A2 size card base out of the candy paper. And now I'm just going to add some of this ribbon. This is like a leathery ribbon in a light green color, and just tie it in a knot, and that card is complete. So using your watercolor backgrounds that you create is a great way to add lots of color underneath any of your background dies. For my next card, I trimmed the watercolor paper down to 5 1/4 by 4, and I cut out of foil paper this beautiful word die. This is from the Beautiful Statement set from the Stamps of Life, and I think that pink foil looks absolutely gorgeous with that pink and green watercolor paper. I did not use the shadow die, I just used the word beautiful, and part of that set is a stamp set, and there is the word hello, which I stamped there, as you can see, and just in some black ink. Then I took another piece of the pink foil paper and I cut it down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and I layered that directly on an A2 size card base in white. And then I added some glue to the watercolor background piece, and I'm adding that directly on top of that foil paper. And I think these colors are so beautiful together, these pinks and greens. I do tie a ribbon in the kiwi color. That's a kiwi ribbon from the Stamps of Life. And I'm also going to bring in a heart that I die cut out of the pink foil. And my heart is from the Merry Christmas 2020 die set from the Stamps of Life. You can use any heart if you wanted to add a heart there. And that completes this card. For my next card, I'm going to use the Autumn Night Sky for my background, and I die cut 2 pieces of artichoke cardstock from the grass die that came with the border set. And I also die cut a tree out of the brown, which is the chocolate cardstock from the Stamps of Life, and that's from the Leaves for Fall set. So I went ahead and added the first layer of grass, and notice that that first layer of grass is much taller than the second layer, and that's because it's going to be layered on my card panel. So I added the tall piece of grass, then added the tree, and then I added the smaller piece of grass right over top, almost like that tree is in the middle of the grass. And then just cut off the excess grass as well as those tree branches. Notice I did put my tree off to the side. I didn't want it directly in the middle of that card. I wanted it off to the side. I am using the Autumn Greetings stamp from Words for Wreath from the Stamps of Life, and I stamped that out with some chocolate ink. And now I'm just adding some of the leaves that also came with the Leaves for Fall die set in banana and cranberry cardstock from the Stamps of Life. I decided to go with some of the bigger leaves. There are some smaller leaves in that set as well if you wanted to use those. And I added the watercolor background piece to a chocolate piece of cardstock that measures 4 15/16 by 5 7/16, and then that is going to go on top of an A2 size card base in white. For my next card, I'm going to bring in the stamp set Bubblegum for Me from the Stamps of Life, and I'm just inking that up in my Forever Black ink and stamping it down onto the Arteza watercolored paper. And again, when you're trying to stamp on watercolor paper, it will take a few times for that stamp to get a really good impression. And I'm bringing in the same colors that I used for the background that I'm going to be using, and the background that I'm using for this card is the one that I created with that Circle Dots stencil. I thought that the dots would be perfect with the bubble gum since they look like dots as well. So I'm bringing in my red color. So I added some of the red ink to my glass mat. I'm also using a water brush from Arteza, and I am picking up the ink from the glass mat with my water brush, and then I'm spreading that ink down on my stamped image. So I am adding the ink darker on the sides and then spreading it out with my water brush. And sometimes you'll see me come in directly with the red Real brush pen and just add that red color directly to the stamp, just as you see there, and then just taking my water brush and extending that ink to create that watercolor look. So I'm coloring up the red. I'm also going to be bringing in the other colors that I'm using, that I had used in the background, which is the sapphire blue and the light green. I'm also going to be bringing in the elephant gray real brush pen to color the dispenser portion of that bubblegum machine. And again, you see that I do come in every now and then with that real brush pen on the edge and just extend that ink with my water brush. And if I need more water on my water brush, I will dip it in the water that I have there on my glass mat, or I can just squeeze out a little bit out of the water brush altogether and use it that way. Sometimes though, if you squeeze it out of the water brush, it might come out in too much water. So it's always best to try and squeeze it out on your glass mat and possibly dry the edge with a paper towel before actually using it on your stamped image, because you don't want to puddle up the water on your image. So just like when you're using these pens to color up some backgrounds, if you add your ink to paper that is wet, you will get a lighter color of ink on your page. But if you add it to dry paper, it will be a more vivid look. And I have an entire tutorial on reviewing these Arteza real brush pens, which I will also link below, and you can take a look at different techniques for coloring your stamps. Now I decided I did not want such a light color on those gumballs, so I'm coming back in after I've my stamp image with my heat tool, and I'm coloring up those gumballs one last time. And again, here I'm also reapplying the ink to some dry paper just to brighten up some of those colors. So now I'm ready to put this card together. I also die cut this happy birthday, and this is from the HSN Everyday Words from the Stamps of Life. It was only available on HSN. I die cut that out of some black cardstock. And I'm going to adhere my bubblegum machine to the left of that. I also colored and die cut just some small gumballs in the same colors, and I'm just going to add 3 at the bottom of the happy birthday. Now this cardstock piece of watercolored paper, I did not trim it down at all. It's the same size as it was when I created the background, 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and I'm just attaching it to a piece of blueberry cardstock that I cut down to A2 in size. This last project is not going to be a card, but it will be a bookmark. So I'm going to be using the stamp set called Life Too Hard by the Stamps of Life, and I'm stamping that out here with some Forever Black ink. And again, you have to stamp it out a couple times because this is the watercolor paper, just to make sure you get a good impression. And now I'm just going to add some ribbon in some of the same colors that are in that bookmark. So it's like a light teal ribbon. And now I'm taking some Nuvo glitter drops in the color Blue Lagoon, and I'm putting them on my bookmark. And the last thing I'm going to do here is just spritz this with some shimmer spray to add some glitter. So this is just a very simple way of creating a bookmark. And if you wanted to add this to a card front, you can do that as well. So here are all the cards that I made using the watercolor real brush pens from Arteza to create these watercolor backgrounds. Again, I will link all the products down below, and if you're interested in these watercolor pens, check out that discount code down below for Arteza. And I will also link the products that are used here for the Stamps of Life in the description box below. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.